Hi all, this is Trish Roberts and you're listening to LiveVegan. This is podcast number 15. With the kind permission of Professor Gary Francione, I would like to share one of his blogs from March 14th, 2007. From his blog site, Animal Rights, the Abolitionist Approach. It's titled, The, quote, luxury, end quote, of death. In last week's blog entry, I mentioned the Vegan Society had interviewed Peter Singer, Tom Reagan, and me in its magazine, The Vegan. In his interview, Singer states, "To avoid inflicting suffering on animals, not to mention the environmental costs of intensive animal production, we need to cut down drastically on the animal products we consume. But does that mean a vegan world? That's one solution, but not necessarily the only one. If it is the infliction of suffering that we are concerned about, rather than killing, then I can also imagine a world in which people mostly eat plant foods, but occasionally treat themselves to the luxury of free-range eggs, or possibly even meat from animals who live good lives under conditions natural for their species, and are then humanely killed on the farm." In brackets, The Vegan, Autumn 2006, end brackets. In Singer's May 2006 interview in Mother Jones, he states, "There's a little bit of room for indulgence in our lives. I know some people who are vegan in their homes, but if they're going out to a fancy restaurant, they allow themselves the luxury of not being vegan that evening. I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't eat meat. I've been a vegetarian since 1971. I've gradually become increasingly vegan. I'm largely vegan, but I'm a flexible vegan. I don't go to the supermarket and buy non-vegan stuff for myself, but when I'm traveling or going to other people's places, I will be quite happy to eat vegetarian rather than vegan." It is quite remarkable that the so-called, quote, father of the animal rights movement, end quote, is a, quote, flexible vegan, end quote. That is, he is not a vegan when he finds it inconvenient to be one. That means that he's not a vegan, and, indeed, he has characterized being a consistent vegan as, quote, fanatical, end quote. Thinks that a vegan world is not, quote, necessary, end quote, solution to the problem of animal exploitation, and characterizes it as a, quote, luxury, end quote, to consume meat and animal products. But these comments make clear a position that is central to Singer's theory and that is absolutely at odds with an animal rights abolitionist perspective. According to Singer, it is the suffering of non-humans, and not our killing of them, that raises the primary and perhaps the only moral problem. That is, Singer does not think that it is a serious problem that we use and kill animals. The only problem is how we use and kill them. If animals have, quote, good lives under conditions natural for their species and are then humanely killed on the farm, end quote, then we do not act immorally in using and eating animals. Why would Singer take such a position? Why does he think that killing a non-human does not raise a fundamental moral problem? Although Singer has stated this position at various places in his writings, his interview in The Vegan contains a recent brief and clear reiteration of his view. Peter Singer says, "I do think that there are morally relevant differences between various species, because the cognitive capacities of beings are relevant to, for example, the wrongness of killing them. I think it is worse to kill a self-aware being, that is, a being who is aware of its own existence over time and is able to have desires for the future, than a being who may be conscious but is not self-aware and lives in a kind of eternal present." In brackets, The Vegan, Autumn 2006, end brackets. In other words, Singer maintains that if a being is not self-aware in the way that a normal human is self-aware, that is, the being does not have what we call reflective self-consciousness, then the being is not self-aware in the morally relevant way that would give rise to that being having an interest in her life, and that would make killing that being a significant moral wrong. As I argue in Introduction to Animal Rights, Your Child or the Dog, and elsewhere, Singer's view is problematic in a number of ways. First, Singer maintains that there is only one morally significant way to be self-aware, to have the sort of representational self-awareness that normal humans have. There are many ways to be self-aware. Any being who is sentient or subjectively aware is necessarily self-aware. Anna Charlton and I live with 5 rescued dogs. When one of our dogs sees another one of our dogs get a treat, the former is aware that it is not she who has gotten the treat, and she comes and sits in front of me until I give her a treat as well. That is self-awareness. She is perceptually aware that it is another dog who has gotten the treat and not she who has gotten the treat. Humans can look in the mirror and recognize their image. Dogs can recognize their scent on a bush that they visited weeks before. Those are simply 2 different sorts of self-awareness. But it is speciesist to say that one sort of self-awareness is morally better than the other. Second, Singer seems to think that only humans, in brackets, and perhaps non-human great apes, end brackets, have desires for the future. Again, Singer's views are speciesist in that he maintains that the only way to have a future desire is to have it in exactly the way that humans do. If a being does not plan things with calendars and clocks, then that being does not have a future desire. We live with a border collie whose favorite pastime is to ride around in the car. If she sees my car keys anywhere, she will grab them in her mouth and come and place them by my feet and look up at me. There is no other way to interpret that behavior except as an expression of desire to do something. The fact that she does not wear a wrist in brackets or paw end brackets watch and think, quote, I'd like to go for a ride in 15 minutes, end quote, is irrelevant. She is expressing a desire about something that she wants to do. Third, even if one's consciousness is rooted in a, quote, eternal present, end quote, that does not mean that that being is not self-aware in a morally relevant way. Consider a human who has transient global amnesia, a form of amnesia in which the person has a sense of herself only in the present, and has no recollection of her past and no thoughts about her future. That is more or less how Singer views the minds of most non-humans, as rooted in a continuing present. Can we conclude that a human with this sort of amnesia has no self-awareness? Of course not. Such a human is self-aware even though she is aware of herself only in the present. Similarly, even if non-humans have a sense of themselves only in the present, we cannot say that they do not value their lives and are concerned only with how we treat them. That is speciesist. Fourth, and most important, there are simply no logical relationship between differences in cognitive characteristics and the issue of animal use. Differences in cognitive abilities may be relevant for some purposes. Consider the case of a severely mentally disabled human. We may not want to give such a human a driver's license because of her inability to drive. But is her impairment relevant to whether we use her as an unwilling subject in a biomedical experiment or as a forced organ donor? No, of course not. Indeed, many of us would argue that her particular vulnerability means that we have a greater moral obligation to her, but it certainly does not mean that we have a lesser one. Similarly, the fact that a cow may have a mind that differs from ours may mean that we do not give the cow a driver's license, but it does not mean that we may use the cow for purposes in which we would use no humans. For Singer, veganism is simply one way of addressing animal suffering. But according to Singer, quote, not necessarily the only one, end quote. We might also continue to allow ourselves the, quote, luxury, end quote, of eating eggs and meat from animals who have had, quote, good lives, end quote, and are, quote, humanely killed, end quote. Given that Singer actively promotes retailers such as Whole Foods, whose animals certainly have not had, quote, good lives, end quote, or, quote, humane, end quote, deaths, what he is really saying is that it is acceptable to consume animals who have brackets perhaps and brackets been tortured slightly less.